here Eric Dunn. Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to have here Eric Dunn and Alban Voppel, our speakers for the seminar series for today. I'll have a brief presentation for both. Let me share my screen. So we are in the second sessions of the Discourse Seminar Series 2022. And the discourse in psychosis is initiative. It's a consortium of researchers interested and focused on multiple dimensions on language as an object of studies in psychosis. We aim to collect data in common protocol to study aspects of symptomatology, phenomenology, and also link it to other biomarkers and social markers, let me say, to see how can we extract common meaning cross-culturally related to psychosis, in spectrum, schizophrenia spectrum disorders, also in other disorders that has psychotic symptoms. So I have some updates. We currently have 131 members at our sites, and we have an ongoing trials in 9 countries in 11 sites in different countries. So it's a very exciting moment to see that we are using the same protocol applying for different situations and contexts. So briefly, we are confident that we'll have the speech bank available for research. So, and in our steering committee, we have Emery Bora, Eric Tan, Gina Koppenberg, Iris Sommer, Lena Palaniapan, Maria Francisca Alonso, Natalia Mota, myself, and Wolfram Hinze. So in our seminar series, we have our, today we are in the second seminar, the automated linguistic. We had in the beginning of this month, the first seminar series. It's already available in the website. And we have plans for sessions until October and also in November. But we are still finalizing some details for the November session. So as you can see, each seminar series, we have 2 speakers. Today we have Alban Voppel and Eric Tan, and the third we'll have Lena Palaniapan and Philip Holman talking about neuroanatomy. And the fourth, Alberto Parula and Pisa Berisha talking about acoustics and artificial intelligence to collect acoustic data and also to analyze acoustic data. In the fifth, we have Wolfram Hinsen and Claudio Palominos talking about grammar and cognition. And in the sixth, we have Megan Baldwin and Philip Sumner talking about temporal measurements using EEG and fMRI. So the structure of the seminar series is we'll have this brief moments of 5 to 10 minutes introduction, then following the first talk on 20 minutes, the second talk also on 20 minutes, some short comments from both of the speakers commenting in general about the others' talks, and then 1 hour of open discussions with the participation of the audience. All those sessions are recorded and it's available if you have interested. Also, it's available, the seminar series from the last year. So if you lost some of the session, you can just watch it on your convenience. So our first speaker is Dr. Eric Tan. He's a senior researcher fellow at the Center of Mental Health in Swinburne University of Technology. He completed his PhD in Monash University in 2015 on the cognitive and linguistic mechanisms underlying formal thought disorders and its impacts on quality of life. He's a junior board member in the Schizophrenia International Research Society, a current member in the Australasia Cognitive Neuroscience Society Executive Committee and in the Discourse Consortium Steering Committee. He's also on the editorial board of the British Journal of Psychiatry, and his research interest lies on studying speech disturbances in psychosis, their underlying cognitive and developmental mechanisms, as well as clinical utility. He's also interested in memory, language, quality of life, and cognitive therapies. And for our second talk, we have Dr. Alban Voppel. His background, he has a bachelor and master's in philosophy, master's in neuroscience in Utrecht, Amsterdam, Netherlands. His PhD was with Dr. Iris Sommer as supervisor in computational speech and psychiatry at the Groningen University. Currently, he's a postdoctoral researcher in Sommer's group and interested in researching quantitative speech and language in psychiatry. So I will stop to share my screen, and please, Eric, you can start. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Natalia. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, cool. All right, thanks everyone for coming. Today, in the theme of this session, which is automated linguistics, I spoke to Alban and we've decided to split the difference between us, and I will do a bit more of the linguistic structural speech analysis components, and then he will do a bit more of the acoustic components. So today in the talk that I've prepared, it's going to be a little bit on a how-to and a what is linguistic grammar speech structure analysis, as well as presenting some data that were recently published late last year on how we've managed to use some of these linguistic speech analyses to support classification of individuals with schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Okay. So I think in what doesn't need a lot of introduction here to this group of people, that abnormal speech patterns are quite prevalent within individuals with schizophrenia and schizophrenia spectrum disorders. And over time, there have been a lot of arguments, there have been a lot of theories, there have been a lot of propositions that your speech and language impairments might just very well be, the core components of the disorder. They pervade things as much as delusions, the way delusions are described. They are also in auditory verbal hallucinations by the very word auditory verbal. And then, of course, they are present in the speech of these individuals. And that is probably the one bit that can be quite noticeable, especially those that actually have it to quite a severe degree. And the important thing about these speech disturbances is that there is evidence to suggest that they do tend to wax and wane and become more severe when when the illness stage is more severe, and vice versa. And over the years, linguists have gone into study these speech disturbances, largely along the lines of linguistic structure, so looking at things like syntax, looking at things like lexical semantics, even down to morphology, phonemes, and syllables as well. And pretty much a lot of the literature has always suggested that you've got deficits pretty much on almost every level, bar one or two. And so back in the great theories of the day, a lot of these speech disturbances in schizophrenia were always subsumed under the concept of construct of formal thought disorder, which is pretty much, disorders of the form of speech, which obviously back in the day were, attributed to thought, and we know a bit better now. And so one of the obvious interesting questions is, formal thought disorder has always been clinically rated by, the listener or the perceiver or the examiner, and that is where you'd always get measures of the severity of the rating. But if we could sit down and look at the work, that linguists have done, psycholinguists have done for decades, and pretty much on, similar corpus of that we are looking at in terms of formal thought disorder, then it lends itself quite easily to the notion that there must be a relationship between what clinicians call formal thought disorder and, what psycholinguists call, these more quantitative speech impairments. And so I guess that sort of led to, the genesis of this whole area of research, where we seek to actually quantify, these the patterns of speech that you can see in individuals with schizophrenia, with bipolar disorder, and psychosis in general, psychiatric patients, really. And so, all in all, I would say, if you looked at the speech that an individual produces, it can be analyzed in, one of four major ways. Linguistic grammatical analysis, i.e. speech structure, which I will talk about a little bit more. Things like temporal analysis, where you actually look at the rate someone is speaking. And we know that, in some patients, it's quite obvious that some of them speak really, really quickly, and some of them just are on the opposite extreme as well. And then acoustic analyses, so things like pitch, volume, and pauses. And then lastly, connectivity, and the connectivity of the speech itself and the sentences and all of that comes through, which, can be assessed using speech graphs. But coming back to what I'm talking about, linguistic grammatical analysis, just looking, at simple sentences, one of the classic ones, quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. How do we break that up into analyses for speech structure? There are multiple ways we can, and of course, in speech, there would be more than one sentence, but just using an example, we can count, for example, the number of sentences or utterances, as it were. We can also count how many words form, these utterances, and get an average of that across the whole speech sample. We can look at potentially how the individual says all these words. We can look at, number of syllables across the different, across all the utterances that are used. We can look at maybe individual words as well, and how many words are there. We can also, and then therefore, once we look at all these things, we can look at whether words are missing. We can look at whether utterances are missing as well. We can look, how many utterances are maybe one word responses, because we know that there may be some clinical relevance there. And then we can also look at whether utterances are intelligible at all, or whether they're not intelligible at all. And so in many ways, it's about, looking at the presentation of the speech, looking at its individual structural components, and then that gives us some quantification that we can actually use in some of our analyses. I'll go into a bit more detail when I as well look at the data that we're presenting and go from there. So obviously, and the thing that majorly jumps to mind when you think about, speech and analyzing speech for its structure or even for its acoustics is actually how that actual speech is actually elicited and recorded, because it's very logical to imagine that people will speak differently in different situations. In conversation speech, where you're talking with somebody and constant back and forth and banter is going to be at a slightly different way, or even a completely different way, to asking somebody to actually just tell a story themselves, where it's basically a monologue just going one way, or asking somebody to describe pictures. And I've put up here a few examples of multiple ways in which speech has been elicited in the past. Even storyboards, for example, where you give individuals pictures and ask them to arrange them together and tell us a story. One of the classic ones where just ask individuals to tell us about what dreams they've had recently. And that tends to be full of, a lot of information. Read and recall tasks are another way to do this. And that is basically asking individuals to read a story and then asking them later to tell us what that story is about in their own words. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, in conversation, which a lot of people attribute quite well as being, the most realistic in situation, environmentally, sound, for want of a better word, way of accurate way of getting speech. But of course, there is validity in all sorts of its different ways. And I think as we continue to move forward in trying to understand how each of these variables might differ between all these different scenarios, and then we can actually get to a more holistic appreciation of where things are. But prior to that, it shows us that there is a lot of work to do. And that is what the Discourse Speech Bank protocol is trying to do. We're basically, we're trying to homogenize speech collection around the world. Data I'm presenting today is not even there yet, but as Natalia mentioned earlier, we're on our way. I think was it 11 sites at the moment. So if anybody has the capacity, we look forward to having your team on board to try and look at these speech variables as well. But I will talk a little bit about how we do it in our lab in terms of the linguistic and structural speech analysis. So we use the SALT software, which is the systematic analysis of language transcript software, which is actually developed to assess childhood speech in individuals with learning language impairments, specific language impairments, as well as autism. And the way that it's done is actually recording speech, largely in conversation, I think, in children, but it can be used, for any of those scenarios that I've just mentioned before. And basically, speech is recorded and then it's actually transcribed and put into an analysis software. Analysis software that gives you things like number of utterances. Like I said, it also can do a few acoustic things such as pauses as well. It can also have temporal analyses and look at things like words, a number of words, and mean number of words per sentences and all that kind of thing. The one thing about SALT that I find really, really useful is, apart from all these standardized codings, we can also get personalized coding, so we can actually insert codes ourselves. And at the end of it, we can get the program to actually sum up how many of a specific code or specific type of error that we're interested in, and do the average calculations and help us come to a more specific understanding of the format of that speech structure per se. And that is something that I find really quite useful. And in the data I'm presenting today, I can also talk a little bit more about how we've actually used it as well. And so I pulled an example of what the speech transcript within SALT looks like off the internet, because don't have ethics to show an actual patient example. But basically you can see here that every single utterance that the participant or the individual makes is recorded as an individual line. Filled pauses, so when an individual is pausing but does something like is actually recorded in brackets, and that identifies it as a specific type of error. Whether it's word replacements as well, something like this indicates a pause of about 4 seconds between the utterances. And as you can see here, this is basically the individual just speaking for the entire period of time. So it actually works quite well to break down things like picture description or personal narratives down to its individual utterances. And then the analysis of all the individual variables that come with that is actually quite good. And then you can actually, code for your own particular errors. Like, for example, using, what it is here, if we basically want to see how many times they mention anything to do with animals, we could just put an extra code around pig or other animals. And then basically at the end we can go, how many mentions in a particular time. That in a way, and we haven't done this ourselves yet, could actually be really quite useful for content analysis. And in lines with, one of the other ways of analyzing speech, which I obviously haven't touched on, is actually what they're saying. So SALT could actually turn out to be quite useful for that purpose as well. And so that's just, it's one of multiple measures that can be used to study speech structure, but it's one that we've chosen to use, and we found it quite useful. And so basically in work that's been done where Alban is and Iris's group and Jana, was actually a bit of the it started a bit of the thinking around, the data that we had around different ways of analyzing speech. So of course, they originally managed to classify schizophrenia patients versus controls based on the length of their utterances and pause length differences, as well as type token ratio, which of course is an all-time psycholinguistic measure of word variability. And that fed into a lot of literature around the fact that specific types of symptoms have specific types of relationships to different types of speech variables. For example, we know that in a lot of psycholinguistic literature that depressive symptoms tend to be quite distinctly related to pause-related variables, so things like number of pauses or how long the pauses are, and where they occur within the speech string itself. And so this type of information, obviously pulling from speech structure and all its components, has helped us, come to an appreciation that, there must be some utility if these symptom domains are being reflected in the way people speak, that we can actually use speech analysis as a sort of proxy to the inner workings of the mind. As I mentioned before, speech is the one thing that we can actually externally assess, and that makes it really, really useful compared to self-reports of back in the day. So one of the things, and I know I mentioned pauses earlier, is that it's not all in all unequivocal. And one of the arguments, and again, drawing back to what I spoke about earlier, is the fact that it depends on how that speech is elicited. Is it, in speech itself, and then you look at pauses and the way people are talking, or actually, and I think in this case, in this paper, it was pauses assessed by an individual reading prepared text. And so I think that's a bit different. I think, it's a context issue, and it harkens back to, the arguments around, what is the best way to get naturalistic speech. And if we go back to much older papers that probably assessed it in slightly different ways, and the basis for a study to try and understand the differences in speech between different diagnoses is evidence that there is some of this, that speech differs between individuals with schizophrenia versus bipolar disorder versus depression, and of course versus healthy controls. And the one thing about this is the fact that it is within those quantifiable speech variables. So it's not within, what you could call more subjective clinical ratings. And so that gave us a lot more confidence that, this was obviously and as we all know, a very valid way to do things. And so lends then to the point of, what is the potential clinical utility of a lot of this work? Because a lot of speech ratings and symptom ratings back in the past were obviously the clinical utility of understanding symptom severity, diagnosing this and that. But then can we use speech to do these things? So of course, in a lot of clinical high risk work back in the day, or not back in the day, like, previous work, that has identified that quantitative speech and the way an individual speaks can be a marker for conversion to psychosis later down the line. And of course, that is pretty fantastic evidence for the fact that there is utility in speech. There is, and we're slowly building up the base of different types of clinical utility, and with diagnosis and classification being one of them. And based on the evidence that we're seeing so far, it obviously suggests, and of course there's more now, and there will continue to be more and more, that assessing somebody's speech can actually be really quite useful in terms of looking at what diagnoses they might have. And because we know that diagnostic instability is such a major problem, especially in schizophrenia and schizophrenia spectrum disorders, and that it's directly linked to their prognoses, if we can develop these kinds of external and more objective assessments, then obviously that's going to be a really, really good thing. And quantitative speech assessment seems to be a promising way forward to doing that. Yeah, mostly touched on that already, because we know that currently diagnoses are made on clinical interviews. They're long. There are problems because a lot of it, we're also quite dependent on an individual's willing to divulge. It's not all in all, from our end of the system. It's sort of a back and forth. But if we can develop, I guess, the blood test for schizophrenia or the blood test for psychiatry, that super objective measure, then maybe, we'll be able to get there. And again, just feeding into this argument around speech structure, what we're starting to find, is that there is a bit of utility attached to things like, mean length of utterances, clauses for utterances, as well as pauses. And you'll see that that example has Dutch and English in it. And so obviously the next question is, do a lot of these variables actually, I guess, are they coordinated, and do they concur across different languages? Because we also know, especially, and this is more of an issue for maybe acoustic analysis, that that different languages are spoken in different ways, different tones, different speeds, and all that those things. And so there is a need to be able to understand and homogenize. And I think at the moment, and I think we've been saying this for months now, we just need the data. Let's get the data, and then we can sort all these things out. But in terms of the data I'm presenting today and what we worked on previously, we wanted to look at these linguistic variables, a bit of speech structure variables, and we also did a few acoustic variables as well, to look at whether they could distinguish between individuals with schizophrenia spectrum disorders versus healthy controls. And then the other thing that I wanted to particularly look at is actually that concordance between these quantitative speech variables as well as formal thought disorder assessments, because as we said, they're both working on that same corpus, and so they should concur. And so within the data that we had at this time, we had 43 individuals with schizophrenia spectrum disorders and 46 healthy controls. And we generally recorded our participants just talking about general topics, so about the daily mood, what they've been up to, things that just generally things that have happened generally in the last week or so from memory. And then after that, we had these recordings independently transcribed by someone who was actually blind to the diagnoses and actually wasn't involved in this particular project up to this stage. And then we used the SALT software to generate up to 41 variables of interest. And as I mentioned before, there's a whole array of different variables that can come from it. We can, and I mentioned this bit before as well, we can actually look at utterances where words are omitted from them. We will also be able to assess where individuals speak over each other sometimes, and two of the utterances actually overlap as well. We're also able to look at the way words are repeated, and because sometimes word repetition is a sign of searching for information or trying to get the right structure, or it could just be a syntactical issue, which again, syntax has been investigated for decades within schizophrenia, and we know that there are receptive syntax deficits and as well as productive syntax deficits. So we should expect to see these here in this data. So we particularly focused in this data on 6 types of speech variables, so utterance variables, word variables as well. We also looked at time, so the rate of speaking particularly. We also actually looked at turn taking as well, which is not a structural speech variable. It's actually more in terms of the conversation as well. And again, because the data we used was in conversation, we were able to look at this. Whereas if you looked at dream reports or picture descriptions, then you wouldn't be able to look at this variable. And so again, coming back to my earlier point that we need to look at it across different things. Pauses as well as formulation errors. So you're a bit more grammatical stuff. And so just very, very briefly, across the sample, I can come back to this a bit later. Generally community dwelling samples, so not overly symptomatic. The one thing I guess I want to draw attention to here, age was generally matched, gender was generally matched as well, is in pretty standard. Pre-morbid IQ was lower in patients versus healthy controls. But interestingly, and this differs from a lot of literature, for some reason within our sample, we actually had patients that spoke a little bit more than healthy controls. And so because of that, we actually calculated percentage scores for all the different speech variables, because if someone's going to speak more, you're going to have more speech errors, and we didn't want that to potentially confound whatever the results that we had. So we control for number of utterances as well. And so, we also correct for false discovery rate within the data. We have a combined sample of schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder patients, and we ran analyses of the variables between the two, and there were no significant differences, so we left it as a combined group. And when we did a group comparison of the patient group versus the controls, we found that out of 41 variables, we had 22 of them that differed between patients and controls, and that's across 5 of the 6 variable groups. So utterances, words, time, turn, and formulation errors. No significant differences were observed in the pauses at all. And I'm happy to go into more detail in that in question time if needed. And so in order to look at classification utility, of course, we went to machine learning. And we decided to use 2 machine learning algorithms to do this, so gradient boosting and random forest. And that's a bit more technical jargon, but an 80-20 training validation split. We had to use this because we only had this particular set of data, and there was no capacity to actually get any more or get a separate validation sample. The one thing that we did choose to put into the analysis was only those 22 variables that differed between the groups. We didn't want to just throw everything in. And pretty much what we found, and within both the machine learning algorithms, which is quite comfortingly, was the fact that we managed to get about 90% of the patient gradient boosting, got 90% of the patients accurately classified and 100% of the health controls. And within random forest, we had 80% correct classification of patients and 90% of health controls. And these are pretty good, I think, where machine learning models are concerned. And so that was quite comforting as well. And overall, 21 speech variables emerged as significant classifiers. And again, this was across utterances, words, time, turn, and formulation error variables. Again, we didn't put the pause variables in because they did not significantly differ between the groups at all. And I've touched on this already, so I'll leave that. It's just all in colors, so you can see the 5 colors and the 5 groups. And just very quickly as well, when we actually ran correlations between the quantitative speech variables, we found relationships to positive symptoms, disorganized symptoms, and excitement symptoms of the PANS, as well as the TLC global rating, but of course that makes sense. And then we actually looked more at individual thought disorder, the TLC scale items. We actually found specific associations with poverty of speech. Actually, one-word utterances was correlated with poverty of speech, but that surprises no one, but it was very comforting to see as well. We also found some associations in our time variables and the pressure of speech variables as well. And actually, the more errors, the more circumstantiality you had, the more speech errors you made. But I guess that also makes sense. And again, very comforting to see. And then we managed to confirm a lot of these with stepwise linear regressions as well, with 11 more patients controlling for sex as well as global neurocognition. And overall, like I said, what we found here, so one-word utterances, poverty of speech, formulation errors with loss of goal, with omissions, and of course, if you had more perseveration, you would have more total completed words. So that makes a lot of sense. And there was a lot of validation around looking at the relationship between your quantitative speech as well as your all clinical ratings, which actually, and the clinical utility of that is the fact that, we can use a lot of these quantitative variables to possibly do a bit of our clinical ratings in future. And so just rounding up a bit, I suppose, a lot of the data, that I presented today, and of course we have more in the pipeline, and so does everybody in this Zoom call, that we can use as quantitative speech for diagnostic and clinical utility. Automatic linguistics is a thing, and it's never going away. I'm very happy about that. What we really need to do is keep building up the evidence base, and it goes beyond just classification. It can also be, as we've shown, symptom analysis. It can also be, things, for example, like suicidality and your other like peripheral I guess, issues that come alongside the psychiatric diagnosis, or even outside, maybe even the neuropsych diagnosis. One day we'll get there. And again, we question what is the best method of eliciting speech, because we need the data. We need to look at it across all these different things before we can get there. The data I presented today shows that we are steps closer, but we can, there is still a long way to go. Discourse Speech Bank, as I've said. Personally, we're currently recruiting more psychiatric groups. So we're looking at major depression as well as bipolar disorder, because it's one thing to say, we found a difference between schizophrenia healthy control. It's great, but we need to do more. And that's what we're trying to do. And everything else, pretty much I've already more or less talked about, and Alban will talk about it as well. And then we'll all talk about it together. So just finish up from me. I'd like to thank my team, supervisors, mentors, as well as interns and students that have been a critical part of this work, and I couldn't have done it without them, as well as all our participants. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. That was very exciting, very nice results. Thanks for sharing. Feel free, everyone, if you wanted to ask some questions in the chat. Afterwards, we'll have all the questions and the time of the discussion. But for now, I want to ask for Alban Voppel. Dr. Alban Voppel, please give us your talk. You have, yeah, thank you.
And let me unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I will thank you very much for the introduction and also the opportunity to speak here. Yeah, I think a lot of the points I will make have already been made by Eric. And as he said, I'll focus a bit more on the acoustics. I noticed one thing you said about the temporal characteristics. I've taken those as acoustics here, so a lot of speech rate as well is in there. Yes, okay. So a short overview of what I will talk about. Similar to the last presentation, I will also focus less on presenting data. There will be some data at the end of a paper we also published, I think, last year. But mostly it will be a short overview and then more about the process and how and what and the choices you can make and the impacts that might have. And at the end, there will be more about like, okay, what's the future and which direction can we go to? So yeah, as we already doesn't really need an introduction here, but acoustic psychosis have been known. Like these patterns can be described in terms of poverty of speech, increased pauses, tone, intensity of voice. And this review by Alberto Parola showed that pitch variability, amount of speech, and pause duration were the most replicated symptomatology present in the acoustics. And there's also quite a clear relation with symptoms. For example, if you have severe catatonia, or a very depressed or flat affect in clinical scores, this will be reflected in speech. So the acoustic aspect of speech. So here we go a bit away from some of the more like the very nice examples of neologisms like hand shoe and time vessel for watch, and it's a bit more about the tone or the so the shape of the voice instead of what the content of what is being talked about. But this is also one of the core symptoms, I feel, at least present in psychosis or in schizophrenia in general. So this is the, if you look at the data, what you get or what you want to get, you can get like these nice spectrograms where you see a lot of the intensity, or you can have like, look at it in this way, where you can also see the time aspect of speech, where you have an area where there's nothing, and then there's some words and talk, and then you can look at how high the peaks are, how fast the peaks are, what the shape of the sound wave is, and if you go to these spectrograms, you can look at specific frequencies and then standard deviations, derivatives over time, all that stuff. You can get things like speech rate, pauses, intonation, tension, pitch, breathiness, and a point I want to make here, a lot more, which is very nice that you can get a lot more, but it can also be a bit of a problem here. Okay. So getting your data, you want to do some research on acoustics in psychosis. What do? You have to do some recording, you have to filter out some noise or clean your data, and then you have to do some processing to get to the features that you want to do, that you want to get. There's a lot of tasks. Eric also showed a few of them. You have the stuff like a picture description task or storytelling tasks. You have reading sentences aloud. You have dialogues, and you also can use data from specific other tasks. For example, cognition or naming animals for 60 seconds can also be a source of speech if this is recorded. And this elicitation in general, leads to certain downstream effects as well. So if you have a very well described task, like for example, a picture description task or storytelling task, you can be pretty sure that there won't be talk from the interviewer on the channel, and you can also use different recording methods. So you don't need two microphones, for example. However, if you have a conversation, as Eric already said, it might be the most ecologically valid, so most close to common life, but then you have problems with crosstalk and with noise and with interactions between the interviewers that are not recorded. So for example, if you smile really nicely when someone tells a nice story, you might give a non-acoustic signal to continue, or there might be other interplays as well. Then there's the recording itself. You can use different types of microphones, recorders, and there's a whole world of audio recording of people who understand way more about this than I do. But this also has effects. So if you go for a nice desk microphone, you will have way less noise than something that is just lying on the table or people play around with it. You can have directional microphones, you can have head-worn microphones, but then it becomes also important, for example, to look at the distance between a microphone and a mouth to say that it keeps constant, or someone's talking a bit and then plays with a pen and touches the microphone, and you get problems with certain ways of recording and others not. And I think also a bit of a glimpse towards the future already, if you want to look at mobile phones, people carry with them, they can record voice or sounds, but then you have a lot of differences as well. So one person uses an iPhone, another person uses an Android, one person holds it a certain way, another person holds it in a different way. There's a car in the background that drives by, a dog might be barking. How do you deal with all these things? So in laboratory settings, you can control these quite well, and as long as it is consistent across in a single study, it should not be that much of a problem. But there are certain choices you can make here. So you get an audio signal from some direction, but it's not done yet. So you have recorded your task or your interview. What do you do with it now? You might have to cut some pieces off. So for example, the prompt of an interviewer, now I want to ask you to tell something about something. And there might be quality control. So for example, a door closed or something happened, like the phone went off, and you want to cut out this piece. You don't want to do analysis on this piece. So you can manually do this type of stuff. You can actually look at the sound wave like this and select areas you want to keep and do that per participant. There's also automated ways of doing this. So for example, doing a speech detection. So algorithms which detect speech. Problem is then that you might miss stuff that is actually a bit not like normal speech, especially in clinical groups. Sometimes you just get bad recordings. So we got access to a data that wasn't actually meant for recording, or looking at acoustic features just for the content. And this was stored in a lossy way. So you get this very nice broad hiss in the middle of your audio wave. And then you need to develop some filter to get this out of there. And sometimes, something just goes wrong and you have to see what you can salvage from your data. Methodology that I will present later on that we use is it's a dialogue setting. So you have two audio channels. So I have a microphone and the patient has a microphone, and you have two separate channels. But then there's the possibility of crosstalk, so the people talking at the same time. And you also only want to analyze the patient's speech and not the interviewer's speech. And there's ways to detect, for example, pauses on the interviewer's channel and then extract those from the patient's channel. So you get like an automated way of only that patient speech, which means you can exclude some areas here of crosstalk where both participants are talking at the same time, or both participants in the interview are talking at the same time. So you finally have your good audio after any number of these steps. You've filtered, you've cut out the pieces you don't want, or if you have a very well-defined task, so a talk for 1 minute about animals, you just press record for a minute, you don't have the interviewer, but then you don't have a dialogue setting. So you get this audio, and now you want to do something with it. You want to look at a clinically informed question, or you want to look at differences between groups. So you have to extract some features. So say you're interested in pauses. There are some papers from the 1950s, 60s, even earlier, where they had an audio task and they manually timed pauses. So they manually timed the areas where there was no sound in an interview. Nowadays we prefer to use automated analysis. So we use certain programs or feature sets to do this, both because it becomes easy to look at larger samples of data, but also because it's more consistent. So what do you think is a pause? Is it 200 milliseconds? Is it 250 milliseconds? What do you count here? And programs like this are consistent in that aspect to analyze acoustics. And the same goes for intensity and that type of stuff. Important here is to question which features you want. Are you interested in pauses, pitch? Are you following previous research? Then you follow the same methodology, but there's lots of different ways to define pauses, for example, or to look at specific markers of pitch, or to use certain programs for that. So I've given a few examples here of programs that I've used personally or that I know that exist that extract audio features. And the example that Eric earlier sold is also looks at pauses and can also look at speech rate or syllables. Praat, which means talk in Dutch, it's also a Dutch program, is a very often used phonetic analysis program. It can also count phonemes and pauses like that. There's Open Smile, which is a German program, and they have recently gone open source as well. So you can have Python implementations of them as well. And any programming language basically can extract any custom amount of features, which is a bit of a problem. So you want standards sets, so something, well, everyone uses this and we find these differences. The problem, however, is that this is still a very developing field. So someone finds something new and other people want to build on that or look further on that or dive deeper into it. So then standard sets might not be there yet, but I do think that they are something to work towards to generalize it. And if you have a general method of elicitation, so for example, the discourse protocol, that helps to also look at standard feature sets and then correlate those to specific things. Standard features themselves, so for example, pauses and pitch, I think due to, for example, the meta-analysis by Alberto, who just joined us, we know that certain things we expect. But as talked earlier about schizophrenia and psychosis is a very heterogeneous group. So if you look at a certain subtype or a certain group that uses a certain medication, say, for example, you might want to look at other features or take broader sets as well. I want to make a small side step to another field. This is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder in US veterans. They did acoustic analysis, so they had interviews of 129 participants, 77 without PTSD, 52 with PTSD. They extracted features and they had 89.1% accuracy. We saw this and was like, wow, that's interesting. Well, I think we can do something similar in psychosis. And you read a bit more and you read that there's 4,526 features were computed acoustics per participant. This is a lot, but it's not weird because this is 2 seconds of a spectrogram of a speech. And theoretically, you could say you have a minute of speech, you could have an almost infinite number of features calculated. Because you can say, look, I'm interested in the first second of the answer, or I'm looking at the pauses between words that the participant is speaking, or I'm looking at a specific frequency or not. So this is very nice that you can have all these features. However, it leads to certain problems as well. So these were their most informative features, and you want to sort of relate them to something that's understandable. You during research, you want to understand something. So you can say, oh, the most informative feature was more monotonous speech between these groups, which is interesting. And then you think, oh, I can follow that. But then you look at the feature that they connect to that. So the relative time distance between the occurrence of the low and median values for a specific spectral feature, the first chroma FFT coefficient, then we extracted the lowest. You see there's a certain explainability gap here. At least I feel that way. It's interesting and it's research that's valuable and that needs to be replicated, and we'll see we basically did the same thing later on. But these are some of the problems that you can get if you have an arbitrary large number of features that you want to explain or that you want to look at. So, short summary, choosing your features is important, especially for generalizability of findings as well. So you want to have some explainability, you want to have some relation with symptoms. And as Eric already said, the relation with symptoms, like that there are certain like positive or negative symptoms that have a certain, whether acoustic or linguistic, that there's a relation there. So if you find something, you would hope that there's also a relation with these symptoms. Another thing to keep in mind, also depending on the task you have or the data you have, is the robustness of certain features if you want to generalize that. So for example, pauses or speech rate or the amount of speech, say 50%, 60%, 70% of an interview, it's quite robust. So if you have a low quality recording or you're in a phone interviews or something like that, this will hold up. But certain chroma features or mousetrap coefficients, they are really depending on audio quality as well. So if you want to, and also depending on the task, of course, whether you can generalize that or not. So a cognitive task or like reading a sentence aloud is very much different than having an interaction or a dialogue. So to our research, where I can sort of show the implementation of some of these thoughts. This is a paper that we published in 2021. And it is really like an acoustic speech paper only in schizophrenia spectrum disorder. So we used 5 to 15-minute audio interviews with the earlier mentioned 2-channel recordings to remove crosstalk earlier and only automatically select the speech of the participant. We recorded this on quite a high quality audio recording, but of course, if you want to do something that's over time more often, you might want to go to a mobile phone anyway. And we did some pre-processing, so we did some audio checks. We calculated the audio features using a standard package of features to not have 4,000 features, but only 88. Although even these are 16 low-level features, and then some speech rate. And then we have, for example, standard deviation, mean, 50th percentile, 80th percentile, also to lead a bit towards generalizability. We had 142 healthy controls and 142 psychosis spectrum participants, and we had 2 research questions. Can we distinguish healthy or schizophrenia spectrum disorder? And can we look at subtypes of schizophrenia spectrum disorder? So subject with more positive or negative symptomatology. And the prompts here was a dialogue setting with open-ended questions like, can you tell me something about your swimming lessons as a child? What's your favorite pizza? Can you tell me about your last dream that you remembered? Also that type of question. So open-ended and not a clinical interview. And this very nice graph made by Jana. Pictures that shows that we have the interview, we extract acoustic features, and we use machine learning, in this case a random forest, and we get 86.2% accuracy in distinguishing patients versus controls. And if you look at positive versus negative symptomatology, so within the patient group only, you get an accuracy of 74.2%. Here you can just see like a short indication of these 88 features that are in this standard package. Following the previous paper, we also looked at the most informative, informative features for the machine learning classifier to see what are we actually measuring. And you see temporal characteristics, but also second format characteristics. And very important here, what I want to point out is that if you only look at the left side of the table, this is interesting. Okay, so these are informative features, but it's also good to just look at standard characteristics. Like, this is actually a characteristic that we'll also be able to measure in different ways. So you can just do standard statistical analysis as well, and you see a significant difference there as well. So that's, I think, also a good recommendation to do, to lead to some explainability or to see what type of data you actually have. Then the relationship with symptoms. So the first 10 here are schizophrenia in general versus healthy controls. And we can see that there are significant correlations with PONS positive, PONS negative. Not so much with cognition, although there is one here for the positive versus negative symptom characteristics, or the positive versus negative classification task with people within that group. There's a smaller group. I think it's 45 versus 42. Because not some people are quite balanced in their positive versus negative symptomatology, but it's good anyway to look at these relations with. So it's always nice to have a relation with symptomatology, so you know you're not measuring something that can't be explained totally, but that there are some relations indeed. Some general thoughts about the future. I think mobile phones are really something that we will probably use, and also clinical interview settings. So people will be admitted and will have an interview with a psychiatrist or treating personnel. And these are two sources of data that I think that are very valuable to look at in the future. As mentioned, there are some problems or pitfalls with, for example, mobile phones. So we have different types. So say you follow someone over time and you want to investigate whether they have how they are doing, and halfway they get a new mobile phone. this might be really a problem because suddenly your audio quality might be very different, or they might have a bad internet, so there are some artifacts on the recording of this. Of course, these can all be with a nice design or with whatever you want to think about it. They can be solved, but there are things to think about that are different than a controlled environment where you have total control over the background noise as well, where you can make sure that's the silent room or that the microphone stays at a certain distance to the mouth. So if you do phonetic or even linguistic analysis with these other types of data, you should take these into account as well. You might go only for the more robust features. So for example, pauses or speech rate or something like that, and see what you can do with those. Also important is what do patients want? So we had a questionnaire to 75 interested parties. So there's some limitations. These are not only psychosis patients. I think a majority is even only depressed, but this is like a sort of a patient board. What do they feel okay with analysis of speech? Would they install an app? Would they record something? And 66% welcomed the idea of having their speech recorded to help their mental welfare. There were some reservations as well, mainly privacy. So people who had some reservations, but also at the bottom, 31% had no interest was because of privacy. Apps were something as well. So not only recording in a clinical setting, but also they would download an app to, for example, talk to weekly, give an update about how they were doing or something like that to monitor something. If it would help their mental health, that's an important part. So not only for research, but that they would feel that this is something good for them as well. And interestingly, 68% of the correspondents favored a recording during a conversation with their clinician, which also is a very different task than, for example, having open-ended conversations. I think this is an initial indication that this is a field that can grow and that can keep going forward, and that there are people are open to this. And I think, of course, in the interest of the research that we're all doing, it's good that this is there, and we think that there's a lot of information present in the speech. So I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I also want to thank some of the co-writers and workers on this paper. First of all, Professor Iris Sommer, and then Jana de Boer and Sanne Bredero, and lots of other people who I didn't get a picture of yet, that also worked on these projects and are continuing to work on projects of this nature. So that was my, let's see. Can I stop sharing? I have some discussion points here, but we can come back to them later after some questions perhaps as well.
Thank you a lot, Alban. Sorry, everyone. I saw that it was an information that was not actually correct on the newsletter, and I could see it just now. Some of you received the correct time for the session today that started 1 hour ago, and some of you just received it 1 hour later. So we are now finishing both of the talks. The session was recorded, but in respect for everyone that attended, I will ask, we have this brief moment of comments on this moment, if everyone is okay with that. Just to summarize the main topics, if Eric could share it with us, and also Alban, and then you can give you some outlines of comments in each other's talk, just to have some good discussion right now. What do you think?
Yeah, no, we can definitely do that. If anybody was at SIRS, they would have seen the bulk of my talk, except with a few extra things. I mean, essentially, if I had to summarize mine very quickly, so basically, I think Alban and I split the difference in today's session, where I talked a bit more about speech structure, linguistics, and grammatical structure, whereas he talked a bit more about acoustic analyses. I talked a bit about of the approach that we take in our lab, using speech transcript software. And actually a point I didn't make as well earlier was the fact that we can actually automate speech transcripts as well. And I know that we've done it in the past. I know it's an automated linguistics session, I know. And in the past, we did a lot of manual transcription, but of course we can automate that as well. And then actually just looking at how speech structure, and because can actually inform different sorts of clinical uses at the end of the day, because speech and language are one of those things that can actually externally assess in these individuals with, psychosis, psychiatric conditions and all of that, versus a lot of, the traditional methods of clinical ratings where we were asking them to tell us what beliefs they had or what their voices were saying and anything like that. And so we start to see from a lot of old literature that there are relationships between the way people speak and maybe a lot of their symptom presentations, or a lot of, highly stressful moments and all that. And so just taking that to and I guess adopting that into the use of diagnostic classification for patients with schizophrenia spectrum disorders, and that was the data that I presented, and being able to, and combining it together with the acoustic analyses as well, because at the end of the day, it's all coming out of that same corpus, and we need to get to that holistic approach. And one of the other major points I think that came out was also the way speech is recorded, which Alban touched on as well. But then we can talk about that in the discussion.
Okay.
So should I also give a short recap? I think most of people here, they saw at least the ending of my...
Exactly.
Yeah, so I basically, as Eric already said, I focus more on acoustics, also about some choices, like the task that you have, how you record it, whether you have one channel, dual channel, stereo, whether it's from a phone or not, and that these all have downstream effects, obviously, on your analysis and the type of analysis that you can do. Yeah, what did I actually talk about for the rest? Oh yeah, feature selection, that's really important. And as Eric already said, sometimes you have features that are quite closely related to clinical symptoms. So that's a good choice to take always anyway. But sometimes you also want to be a bit more exploratory, and you want to select features, and you can select a lot of features using phonetics or acoustics rather. And there's certain overlap as well. So if someone has poverty of speech, you can measure that basically by counting the words. So in a transcript, you can also just look at the sound wave and see that there's not much sound in there. And this can be two ways to measure the same symptom, as we would say, like poverty of speech. Then there are some implementations or choices you have to make regarding, because a problem is the feature set, I would say, at least for phonetics, like which features do you take? Are those interpretable? Do those generalize also cross-linguistically? So speech rate is one thing that I think, okay, every language has a speech rate, but is there an innate difference how fast the information is conveyed in certain languages or not? Is that different across languages? Phonemes are certainly different across languages. So if you have a certain phoneme, you're like, hey, this is a marker for schizophrenia, I would be very hesitant to follow something like that. So that's sort of like the playing field in acoustics as I see it. And then there's quality control, like how do you check if you only have the participant speech or not, and if there's sound, how you cut it out. Some programs. I'm also interested to hear from the public, like the listeners, whether if they have programs they really like. So Eric mentioned Salt, for example, which also has some parts. I really like Praat and Praat scripts, and also OpenSmile. But I know that if you dive deeper into something, or you want to be robust, or you want to be informed by meta-analysis, for example, you have to choose which features you want to extract and not so much follow a standard package. And in the end, I presented a small paper from us in 2021 about acoustic analysis, basically putting all these things in certain choices we made there based on the data, and that showed that there are acoustic differences between patients and controls, and people with certain symptomatology, so more positive or more negative symptoms. I think that's a sort of short.
Okay, thank you all, and sorry again. But let's start our discussion, and feel free if anyone wants to make a question. I saw in the chat that Elena Palaniapan had a question after Eric's talk.
Yeah, I saw that one, Lena. Thank you for that. And I think it just touches on exactly what Alban was saying as well, in that data you showed with 40,000 features. And because it's a very relevant question of meaningful approaches for dimension reduction and limiting variable space with classification approaches. I think it makes a lot of sense because, you know, I've just said we can get a lot of variables and we should try and, you know, get as many as possible to get that kind of holistic appreciation of what speech is. But at the same time, you can't really have all of them because then you'll definitely find something, and that's not really what we want to take as the approach. I think for us, we went with, I guess, what can be considered a bit more of a crude way, because we knew we were going to look at the difference between schizophrenia patients and controls. And so we went, let's look at the variables that differ between them and just use them. But of course, it's going to be a lot more complicated when we start to look at, you know, 4-group or 5-group comparisons, and as I said, between schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, and then healthy controls. And then maybe that method will fall a bit flat. I'm not terribly sure I have an answer. That was the approach we took before, but I'm happy to hear what other people have to say.
Thanks, Eric. That's very helpful. I mean, what I see happening is a phase the field will go through where there is a lot of exploratory work that all of us will be involved in, trying to see what is the best way to pick these features. I wonder if we can think in some terms of what are the best practices when people do those explorations. For example, should we be guided by relationship between these variables and syndromes, like the work that Sunny, you are doing, relating positive syndrome, negative syndrome, and other symptoms with these variables, and then selecting from that? It's a bit of a top-down approach. Or should we select from what other people have already been working on and shown as the horse to bet on, so to speak? You know, like semantic coherence, for example, and other variables are really being much used in the literature at the moment for predicting transition, for example. So should we go with literature search and then, you know, reduce our variable space? I don't think the choice is which is the right thing, but what are the few aspects that we should all consider if you're going down this exploration route? Any tips from either of you on these exploratory approaches would be very helpful.
I can give a short, like, I think also mentioned by Sunny, I think you can use external validation. So you can get a different sample where you replicate it and then you alleviate some of the problems of being totally exploratory. Cross-validation and all these types are certain ways to approach it as well. I think if you have large enough samples, you can make a valid point, like, hey, we do totally exploratory here and then have a separate testing set, really. But yeah, as I say, I think it's also generally a phase. In the scientific process. So at a certain point, you want to be really broad and you want to be really exploratory and to look at it and then narrow that down to, for example, by using a meta-analysis and to see which features have been most replicated. Problem in a heterogeneous group is, again, if you have a sub-question. So you want to look at older people with schizophrenia versus depression. And just a subset of the older people already changes quite a lot of the features already. So then you might want to look at, you have to do the same thing again. You first have to be exploratory for that sub question and then replicate it again. So especially also between diagnosis, differential diagnosis would be quite hard to do yet with a standard set. Although clinically informed and then starting and taking a bit more might be a good approach as well.
Thanks. I have some tips. When we have this issue, we made some correlational studies with the symptoms and the phenomenology, and also comparisons between groups. Those pre-analysis was to see the variables that presented some interpretable results, and then use them only those features to apply to machine learning algorithms. To have more clear.
These are very helpful. I mean, one challenge within our group we often face is even before you get into the stage of feature selection, you have to do a pre-selection in some sense, because there are a lot of variables that are correlated with each other. For example, a lot of acoustic variables may show correlation with the syntactic or semantic variables. We do not know fully those correlations yet. So one has to really do this kind of pre-selection before we get into the final set that can even enter the clinical, correlation phase. I was wondering if people do this, and what kind of steps people do to clean up. I mean, I think most of us jump with what we know. We bet on something and we start there. I've never betted on acoustics. We've never done any acoustics work, but I'm very keen to learn on from Alberta and yourself, Alban. So we just started with semantics and syntactics because we knew a little bit about them, and we started there. But that's probably not the best approach.
So I've used, there's one statistical approach called, or tool called variance inflation factors, and it tells you which of the variables are a linear combination of other variables. And so that's just one strategy that I've used to do some selection, as you said, among the highly correlated acoustic variables and others.
That's good to hear, Sunny. That's a useful tip. We'll explore that. Any other thoughts on that? Alberto?
Yeah. I think that the very starting point should be having very good and open data, because in my experience, there are really a lot of different techniques that can be used for all these different stages. I mean, for preprocessing, you could do manual cleaning or you could do automated cleaning. And the same for, I mean, machine learning techniques. You could use very different techniques, from more interpretable techniques to deep learning, convolutional neural network, and so on, that are really less interpretable, but probably more effective. So the problem is that, in my experience, if you don't have large data set and you are not able as a research community to work on that data set, it's very difficult to establish what is a good practice. For example, for the preprocessing and the cleaning of the data, we don't know if using automated cleaning, that it could be really could really help to save money, to save resources, and to speed the process. We don't know, for example, with our dataset, if, because we have not the size necessary to establish the robustness of this procedure, we don't know if on our recordings and with our patients, if using automated cleaning could produce the same result as doing manual cleaning. And this is the same for a lot of other different, I mean, level of analysis. Is the same for using different machine learning techniques. If you don't have this large data set, you don't know in advance, especially because of the specificity of the population, the specificity of the data collection settings. So what is true for phonetics in general cannot be true for our specific field and for the specific condition which we make the recordings, for example. So it's very difficult to, I mean, there are in the literature a lot of possible solutions, but without having a priori good data and open data, it's very difficult then to test if which between these techniques, which one are most suitable for, I mean, in this case, I think that our main aim is clinical applicability.
Yes, and just to complement, the larger your data set is, more features you can extract. Actually, it's a balanced on the sample size and also the amount of features that you have. So if your sample size is small, it's even more restricted, the amount of features that you could explore in that sample size. So given that, that's the exciting news that I gave in the beginning, and I wanted to share again with you guys. We have nowadays 11 sites collecting data. Okay, so 9 countries, different languages, collecting the protocol that we established here. So it would be very nice to have a speech bank data set with the same protocol collected cross-culturally to disentangle this. Roberto, do you wanna share? I saw that you, please feel free if you wanted to open your microphone. Or if you prefer, oh, thank you.
Well, thank you. I just was brushing my hair.
Okay.
No, I just wonder, I mean, I've been watching all the presentations in this seminar, most of them with using machine learning techniques, which are very important and very useful techniques. But my question specifically in the context of today's presentation, is, I mean, when it comes, following on Lena's point, when it comes to dimensionality reduction in the selection of a subset of variables, why don't we start by using a solid theory of language and psychosis? And from that theory, we can come up with a very small variable space. And we can be saving time, effort, sample size, and all the downsides of fishing expedition, which most of the time is what we must deal with when we engage in an extraordinarily large dimensionality in terms of number of variables. So why don't we start with a theory instead of going and picking variables randomly? Perhaps when I question myself, when I look at most of these works, is what is the criterion to select the variables? Sometimes the criteria to select the variables is mostly, oh, these are the variables that the software gives me. Sometimes, oh, these are the variables that are easier to pick from this speech sample. But I don't observe in this large data set analysis using machine learning a solid theory. And based on that theory, picking the variables that are more important to answer our questions, which is the relationship between language and psychosis. So why don't we start with a solid theory, any theory? It's an open question.
Yeah, thank you. It's the question of data-driven or theory-driven questions, things like that, isn't it? Great. Eric, Alban.
Recently, we, or at least I am a personal projects have been going more towards this direction. So we looked at a larger, or at least we go from 4,000 to 30,000 where we started towards 88, because that was the set that we used here was an emotion recognition task originally, and it was chosen by 16 linguists saying, well, these capture most of the expression present in voice. So this is already a bit more theory driven, but however, not specifically towards psychosis. But looking at meta-analysis, like for example from Alberto, nowadays I'm more inclined to choose 4 or 5 features, depending on what you look at. So for example, pause rate or intonation or stuff like that. So it's going in that direction, I think. There are some directions, however, where I think that the exploratory nature will still be necessary, because I do think that there's even acoustic difference between people, or that you could measure an acoustic difference between people with remitted psychosis and some negative symptoms and depression. But there, the conceptual framework is, I think we have to build it first. Like, what is the difference here? Because we don't know yet. Like, we think that they're not the same, but they have overlapping symptoms, but not all of them. We don't know the specific characteristics of the stuff that doesn't overlap. So I think it will be a balance to keep for a while still before we have a strong theory, like, oh, this is exactly what happens. And it's a heterogeneous population. So if you have first episode psychosis, I don't think it generalizes to ultra high risk or to chronic who has been using antipsychotics or have been smoking a lot more for over the years. This might impact this as well. But yeah, I don't have a good answer. That basically is the answer I have.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, a lot of people move towards quantitative speech assessment because our original top-down theory-based concepts weren't enough and weren't actually, getting us to that point. And I think I agree with what Alban's saying. I think we're still at the stage where we need to figure out what the commonalities are, what the differences are. I think, I presented a bit of data looking at, crossovers between formal thought disorder ratings and a lot of your quantitative variables. And we're starting to see, for example, poverty of speech is associated with your number of one-word utterances, and that makes sense. And so we can maybe move forward with something like that. But then again, it depends on which, participant group you're going for. Again, clinical high risk, first episode, chronic patients, 4 episodes in, chronic patients, 1 episode in, 2 episodes in, so that all these things and their lifestyle choices make a bit of a difference. We all know that going with speech, which can be affected by so many different things, is going to be, a challenge in many ways. But I think we're still at that kind of discovery stage. And I agree with you. I think let's go, and if we can get to that point where we can narrow down this dimension space and the variable space and go, pauses are much more relevant. For example, let's say in depression, let's definitely do pauses because a lot of the data is pointing that way. I think we're still at that data collection stage. I feel I've said this all evening, but I think we are. And so I agree with you. And one day we will get there. I don't know we're there yet. we have questions.
Sorry, questions from Amelie. Oh dear, you are muted.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah, sorry. It was more like a follow-up on what Roberto was saying, like about the idea of like going with a model or a framework, and like it was more to ask like if I was looking for a model, like most of the work that's been done on language production and schizophrenia comes from thought disorder, and then like in my mind, it's not that easy to apply to the kind of work that's more about like more refined aspect of the content of speech. And so I was just wondering if like anybody had like good ideas of how to use like thought, like things like the work that's been done from the thought disorder approach, or if there is something else that you would have in mind that could be useful, like so it was just more like a follow, like just like thinking as a group, like how like, so like what can we find, like is there anybody that has an idea of like how like so like how like where to look like?
I can shortly, like, I think we know from a clinical perspective that the negative symptoms stay longer usually and don't respond as well to medication. So, and that's something that I think we're measuring often. The patients that we include in our studies are often remitted, so they're not severely psychotic or they don't have a lot of positive symptoms. So you measuring negative symptoms is, I think, something, but I also have the impression, or at least in my conceptualization of schizophrenia, these change over time as well. They can get more severe, or they, for example, if you have another episode after that, or it's a step model of reduction after each psychotic episode, that or capacity of cognition, for example, that this might be something that we could measure, but it also depends on your clinical measure. So if you want to look at ultra high risk, or you want to predict psychosis or a relapse or an effect of a treatment, then what you want to measure apart from formal thought disorder, which might not be present or might already be gone, is something depending on that specific question, I think, like the field that you want to look at or the question that you want to answer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, and you know, we all know the thought disorder approach is not a unitary approach because it depends on which measure you want to use and which approach to thought disorder you're actually taking. Because while most people tend to be using the TLC and we have the 18 different variables in there, you can use the communication disturbances index, which is more about, you know, disturbances of meaning, and it's more a pragmatic based measure, which is still related to the disorder. So I think there's a lot we can try and pull. And I think maybe that's what's so attractive about that automated linguistic bottom-up data-driven approach is, can we find these, you know, more speech-based measures of these top-down concepts, and then we can actually look at, you know, where they cross over, how we can homogenize them, and then when we link them, and one day, pipe dream, link them back to, you know, the thought disorder concept or all these different concepts, and then we can go, oh, they were right, or maybe not so much, but then we have a framework to go forward with. That's what I think.
Tony?
Thanks. So first I wanted to, I think there's actually something beautiful that there's approaches from both directions, and you know, hopefully one day we meet in the middle or somewhere in between and connect all of the bottom up and the top down. I think that one thing that one challenge I've met with especially is that there's certain analytical strategies where there's only really one way to do it, like counting the number of words in an utterance, like, you know, that's straightforward. But I think when you get into different ways of looking at semantic coherence or some of the graph analysis methods that are out there, there are, even if you have the same theoretical approach to something, there are probably still 100 ways to look at that to try to get at the same conceptual idea. Like for semantic coherence, for example, there are many different embedding, methods out there and many different language models that we can use to come up with the semantic embeddings for words, and then many different ways, as I think Alberto covered very well in his recent paper that looked cross-linguistically at validating different methods of looking at semantic coherence. Not only that, but there's different ways of comparing the semantic content. So I don't know, I find that I'm still in a pickle in this respect.
Lena?
Natalia, I think I agree with almost everything that's being said, but I also want to point out that the goals may be very different between prediction and explanation. If you want to explain, what causes thought disorder, what causes language problems, we need theories. We really need sound theories, but not all theoretical leads will be predictive of a progression in the illness response to treatment. Just to give an analogy, I recently heard. We know that there is a bacteria called Borrelia which causes Lyme disease. Lyme disease is a joint problem. It's a long-standing problem. But before people develop Lyme's disease, they develop a rash, and that rash is very, very telling of Lyme's disease. So if you find the rash, you can definitely predict that people are going to develop Lyme's disease. But there's no logic. There's no reason why people with rash should develop knee problems. So you cannot really explain the Lyme disease symptoms with the rash. You can only explain that with the Borrelia, with the germ that is causing it. The reason I'm pointing this out is both are necessary, because we need to understand the theoretical basis of why people develop language problems. But that understanding will not predict the outcomes, definitely, not necessarily predict the outcomes, unless the outcomes are, unless the causal pathways are completely measurable. Some of them may be, but not all of them. I think when we try to predict things like transition to psychosis or things like response to treatment, our goal is simply to see how good can our prediction be. Our goal is not actually to worry about what are the predictors which are entering this, because we want to ensure that clinically this is applicable, this is useful. So often we don't worry about it. But when we try to understand it, it's completely opposite. When we try to understand what is causing relapses, what is causing remissions, we really need to worry a lot about predictors, not about how good they are. They may be weak, but they may be very probabilistic. So we need to really still work on that. And this is why I said the phase of exploration is here for us to see. It's going to stay for the next few years. And that's not going to, even with causal explanation, that's not going to go away. I think explorations will continue, even if explanations are fully available, because prediction is not the same as causation.
Amélie?
Yeah, just to add that, like, to me, like, this idea of like prediction or link with symptom is all very interesting, but like in the end, language serves to communicate, and I think we should not forget that, like, any language disturbance will necessarily, like, or not necessarily, but has a potential to have an impact on the patient's like everyday interactions, social interactions with others. And I think that it's also something that's like we have not focused on so much, but to me that's like the super important thing, because in the end, like, we want, yes, to identify symptoms, identify like difficulties, like predict psychosis, but like the end goal of all that is to help people like get better lives, like, or at least to me that's what like the end goal is. So like that's how I got interested in language. Like, I'm interested in social cognition as well, but like, because to me, like, all that has a direct impact on your everyday interaction is something like super relevant. And like, just one thing, I think, like, if eventually if the people doing like more acoustic stuff like wanted to cite it, but like in a recent study that we're like it's in a revision right now, but like we found like a 0.79 correlation, like a really, really strong correlation between how expressive people are perceived and how interesting they are perceived. So to me, this is something like that, like, so like highlights so well the relevance like of like all those like differences in expressivity can lead you to be perceived as less interesting. And then like, what impact can it have in your everyday life? Like if people don't find you interesting, like, are they going to be interested in like, interacting with you and like that kind of thing? So I think it's like, anyway, just to add to this like thinking about like sort of the impact of all that, like on everyday life, on people's everyday life.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that, Emily. It's right, because it's the primary thing, and that will impact on their lives. I think at this point, maybe what we're trying to do a bit more is trying to see, if there is a way we can harness these speech patterns for the purposes of actually better diagnosis, leading to better treatment, leading to better identification, and then also impacts on their functioning and quality of life. Because I agree with you, that is always has to be the end point of everything that we do, because every line on an SPSS sheet is person.
I didn't mean to make it seem like everything else was natural.
No, I'm not.
Like it's just like, to me, it's like a whole thing, and this is a part, like one part of the whole package.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think I'm actually, Alban, you said something earlier that I actually wrote down because I thought it was really interesting. And I wrote this down. I said, how to record smiles in conversation. And I think it was that point you made that, here we are going, this is speech, and we're looking at this response to that, this and that. But what if somebody makes a non-verbal expression, which is very common in, the naturalistic, ecologically valid settings? We don't capture that in what we're doing. And so what is that about?
Yeah. And I think like in the discourse protocol, are there tasks that are interactive also, or is it all
there is a conversational
for yourself? Like, are you doing something with somebody else in some of the tasks? I can't remember, because like I've personally moved to like from like having people just speak towards like speaking to do a joint task with somebody else. And like it really brings some like another dimension also to the.
Yeah, I think it's a valuable addition. It also brings its own set of problems. So, for example, if you're a 60-year-old man with chronic schizophrenia and you're talking to a 24-year-old girl, a research student, that is quite a different interaction than you might have in your daily life, and also quite different interaction than a 24-year-old guy who has his first psychotic episode and talks to the same person. Yeah. So this becomes a possible confounder. I think it's very important to capture as well.
I understand what you mean, but the tasks that we are using are standardized enough that everybody is speaking about the same thing. So anyways, like maybe eventually I could like present to you the different tasks that we're using, but
yeah, we mostly use conversational data as well, so it's something that we're also used to or thinking about, or like you want to standardize stuff, but yeah, it brings additional confounders. I also saw from in the chat about taking cameras, videos as well, posture, facial expressions, taking those into account as well. It's very interesting. I'm also get really impressed by that type of research, but it's also really hard, at least in my opinion.
We have a lot of also contributions in the discussion in the chat. Do you wanna to open up your microphone, or do you wanna to share with us your thoughts on factor analysis?
Hi. Was it me? Yeah. Oh, okay. No, I was just kind of going back to the time when we were looking at multiple substances and the correlation with dropouts. Each substance is so highly correlated. In the end, we ended up doing the multiple correspondence analysis to break down the substances into groups. Clinically, it didn't make sense because the groups never really add up. But the good thing was that when we repeated it in another sample, we were kind of getting similar signals. So I don't know whether statistically the factor analysis created some underlying groups that were more consistent in prediction than, let's say, clinically relevant or understandable variables. I mean, as a clinician, I don't like it because my hypothesis was methamphetamine causes dropouts. and then I had this factor that didn't make sense. So it was just an interesting experience as a clinician.
Thank you. Sunny, you added some answers. Do you want to share with us?
Oh, just on the factor analysis, I thought that it related to what Lena was actually saying at the time when when I was typing in the chat, that I think factor analysis can be quite useful from a statistical perspective, and for the goals of prediction, they can be quite valuable, but probably maybe, as Rohit was pointing out, in part, they're not so great for explanation.
Okay.
Just a quick addition to that comment, Sunny. I don't have strong emotional reaction to factor analysis, but it always slightly annoys me when people start naming factors with names that people haven't heard of, and these names becomes explanations. Unfortunately, this is applicable for every factor analysis. And then these factors are not something that you can measure directly, because if you call something as, let's say, ALP factor or TLC factor and so on and so forth, yeah. they just add another layer of inexplainability to what we're trying to understand. Even though dimensionality reduction wise, and also understanding how things go together, factor analysis has been really valuable historically for work. Anyway, there's just a personal annoyance comment on factor analysis.
Yes. This discussion reminds me the discussion that Stokes had on the basics and applied science in the Pasteur quadrant. So he's inspired by the way that Louis Pasteur conducted his research by looking at explanations and also applications of what he was discovering about microbiology and fermentations and all this stuff, and how this one line of research actually fed the other line of research. And this trajectory could be very rich if we can think together that both applicational purpose and also explanation purpose are actually given different sides of probably the same phenomenon. And one thing that I could thought that maybe it's timing that we are looking at these questions, that we have to do at least some kind of exploratory analysis, because the technology is new. Maybe the phenomenology is not new, but we are looking at this, applying our interactions with the patients and elaborating some theories about those interactions. But maybe there are some exploratory findings that could shed a light into some variables that are driving some behaviors that we cannot explain only by looking at our cultural lens. Because when we are interacting with anyone, we are actually using our cultural references to see if that behavior, it's actually a nice behavior or a pathological behavior. What is the normal line? We are actually, it's that's definition, it's dynamic. So I believe that maybe we are in a certain point of this line of research that we still need to make some exploratory analysis, more when applying some new tools and new ways to look at those behaviors. And then we can actually modify some ideas of the theoretical plans. How can we understand this social cognition, for example, into interactions and psychosis, in psychosis spectrum. And maybe those theory-driven questions should be our end point to start with exploratory analysis, yes, but for certain point, at least until we have a common data set or some common results across languages, across cultures, we can actually trying to develop new ways to understand that in a stronger theory to explain these interactions. I don't know, just to share. Okay, Yana, and you also had some contributions here in the chat. Do you want to share those with us?
Yeah, sure. I really like this paper by Covington. It's an older paper. I think most of you know it, but it's quite rare. It's the linguist's view on schizophrenia. And I think that is what often is lacking in this line of research and why we have so few theories, because we all look at schizophrenia language from a clinician's point of view or from psychology or from artificial intelligence, but there are so few linguists actually looking at this. And linguistics is just such a small branch of science, and there's so few linguists actually interested in computational linguistics. So yeah, that makes it difficult that all these different branches of science try to interpret language, and the linguists keep quiet on this topic. So that's why I like this Covington paper, because at least they really explain what you can see linguistically in the speech of schizophrenia patients. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Roberto, you had your hands raised.
Well, thank you. Just to clarify where my question came from, I mean, the question, the dichotomy between data-driven and theory-driven analysis as two opposite sides of the spectrum in science inquiry, I mean, it is a valid question. I mean, it is more philosophical than practical. I mean, normally in statistical textbooks, this is the first chapter we read: data-driven, theory-driven, explanation versus causation. I mean, this is one perspective. Another perspective is philosophical. I mean, the contradiction is philosophical, but this is not the question that I raised. The question is, when it comes to solving the problem of dimensionality reduction, we need a criterion. So one criterion is relying on a theory to reduce the dimensionality space. The other criterion is to explore the world and find those correlations that are more informative. And my question was, why most of the time in the field, I can observe that many people tend towards the exploratory side rather than towards the theory side. And this is my question: why don't just switch the field to the theory side and see, okay, we can reduce the dimensionality by relying on the theory. By the way, going back to Lena's point, I gladly disagree with him in terms of theory doesn't predict, which is totally false, Lena. Newton theory predicted how to put the human species on the moon. So theory make predictable inquiries. Any hypothesis-driven work is somehow based on theory. So prediction is an inherent part of theory. However, we can also make predictions based on data. But the question is not this. The question is how we can deal with the problem of dimensionality reduction in speech analysis that is pervasive in the field of exploratory works. And my solution to that problem is, let's go to a theory and get the variables we're interested in relying on that theory. That is the clarification I wanted to make.
That's helpful, Roberto. I think one of the challenges we have with, at least with schizophrenia, is that there is no strong theory. For example, if you ask what causes the language problems, there are many competing theories, equally strong or equally weak, however you want to see them. So one has to have a pluralistic view to start with, rather than leaning towards one side, if prediction is the goal to start with. Secondly, I think one of the challenges is what Alban mentioned in his talk, is the problem of heterogeneity. There may be different groups of schizophrenias we're dealing with, different groups of illnesses we're dealing with multiple different theoretical explanations for each person's problem. So there's no one all-encompassing explanation like what Newton got for gravity, for example. And if we have one like that, I think that would be very appealing. And many decades have been spent trying to find that kind of single causal explanation. I think the closest that people can come to is there is something abnormal in dopaminergic pathways, and that could be the final common expression point. But that hasn't really translated to patient benefits to significant extent. But I take your point that there has to be some theory leaning in the initial exploration, and that theory has to be informed by prevailing hypothesis or hypothesis, whatever you want to take home as.
Okay, I think we have more 5 minutes. Sunny raised the hand, and also Alberto, if you wanna to conclude our discussion, please feel free.
Thank you. I was wondering if I could get people's reactions. So in a paper that's actually under review in the discourse edition of Schizophrenia Bulletin, we did Lena's pet peeve. So we did a factor analysis in a fairly large group, and we found some we found some 3 dimensions, but and in particular, we found incoherence and what I called inefficient speech, as well as impaired expressivity. But we felt that these could be explainable by linguistic theory. And in fact, we related these 3 dimensions to Gricean pragmatics, which is a cornerstone of pragmatic linguistic theory. And that I suppose I actually feel that these are true dimensions of that in terms of different ways that language impairment manifests in psychosis that aren't, I don't think they're there just because of the scale we used, because actually the factors we found are remarkably similar to totally independent work that Frederica did, which was recently published. So yeah, I suppose,
just
throwing it out there.
Quick clarification of my comments. And factor analysis itself is not the problem. I think sometimes the issue is we have to give some descriptions to these factors, but in some works, at least, these factors are taken as explanations, but they're not, and they don't have much role to play in the taxonomy of the symptoms and the syndromes we study, because these are observations, not really any sort of hierarchies that are naturally existing. These are existing only because of the data that we see have this kind of correlation patterns, so to speak. So that the nomenclature is always problematic, but I get the point that people have to name these things, or else it's very hard to communicate what exactly you saw in a data set.
Yeah, but I guess how else do we connect the data to the theory? Because that's, to me, I'm not sure how else to connect it. I feel like it's one way of seeing patterns in the data, and then sometimes these patterns are just sporadic, but I think sometimes they're grounded in explanatory models. Yeah.
And some of the factors have stood the test of time, as we all know, like positive negative syndrome, and the 3 little syndromes have been replicated many times now in the literature. So yes, I mean, some of them will stay, and the nomenclatures will also stay.
Yeah.
Alberto?
To answer to Roberto, I totally agree with him about the importance of doing more theory-driven research. My thought is just that it's not so straightforward for different reasons. The first is that, suppose that, that formal thought disorder are really important. So that the theory says that formal thought disorder are really important. And then you have a first problem. You should decide which tools used to measure formal thought disorder. There are many tools to measure formal thought disorder in literature, and most of them generally are conflicting and not the same. Then you have to operationalize, for example, using natural language processing, formal thought disorder in a linguistic view, and you have a really 1,000 of choices on how to formalize, operationalize formal thought disorder, how to measure formal thought disorder in language. So you have, and then you have also, I mean, heterogeneity of patients, and you have also heterogeneity of fields in the sense that you should put together the theory on schizophrenia with the theory on linguistics. So you have different levels that are generally not so straightforward. So you have not a theory that can inform you on which symptoms or linguistic variables look at. You have different theory on schizophrenia, different theory on language, different theory on social cognition, and most of these theories are really conflicting. And so this is the problem. I think that taking your suggestion, what we could do as a research field is try and working on put together these different levels. So the point is really that without interdisciplinarity and in putting together different theory to make more precise prediction and to test this prediction, we can go much farther in my view. So this is the big problem. And this is because it's so difficult, because the interdisciplinary work is very, very difficult. And also we still need good data and large data set, because with this heterogeneity, for example, I read in the literature, there are some works of Wolfram Insen that are really good work on testing theory, linguistic theory on patients. For example, they found in a paper that it's not poses in general that makes the difference between patients control, but only some specific poses, unfilled pose in a certain position. And this could be linked to cognitive load, for example. But also to test this hypothesis, this could be due to the contextual condition, how you recorded, for example, the task. So you should also still need large data set, because with this heterogeneity, also to test, you should work on make more precise prediction, but then to test this prediction, you should have larger data set in my view. Otherwise, with this heterogeneity, you can generalize as well these results.
Not to mention that those theories, maybe some of them didn't take into account the representativeness of underrepresented populations that are not studied in the same way. So
yeah, I forgot to mention cross-linguistic variability, cultural variability, and linguistic variability, and so on. So yeah.
So that was very nice. Thank you all for attending. It was a very nice moment to spend here in Rio de Janeiro my morning. I suppose that you have other times there. And sorry again for the mistake on the time, okay? Some of the other sessions have other timing, so it's not actually always the same time, okay? And we will share with you all a new newsletter with the timing for the next session, okay, in the end of next month. So thank you all and have a nice day.